All right, so let's talk about aperture. Now, in the last video, we talked about shutter speed, which is the amount of time that your sensor inside your camera is exposed to the light that's coming through the lens. Aperture has to do with your lens, and that has to do with how wide the aperture inside of your lens is opening. Inside of your lens, there is an iris, and it looks kind of like an eye, and it opens and closes based on what your settings are in your camera. So cheaper lenses have a smaller range of that aperture. Their aperture can only go down so small and can only get so big, which means that only a smaller range of light can come through. In low light situations where you're trying to get more light into your camera, you want to open up that aperture wider, which actually means a smaller number. So a little confusing. A 2.8 aperture is wider than a 12 aperture, which is actually smaller. So you just have to kind of put that together in your head that, okay, a smaller aperture number, an f2 or an f2.8 is going to be bigger than a 12 or a 14 or an 18 or something like that. As you spend more money on your lenses, which means higher quality lenses, that aperture range becomes larger typically. In all of the lenses that I use, I either have a 2.8 or wider, which means 2.8 or a 1.4 or a 1.2, which is really wide, which is going to let a lot of light in. And on most of these lenses, I'm even able to go up higher on my aperture number, like 14, 18, 20, which is a smaller aperture, letting in less light. And so there's a couple different things that happen when you adjust that aperture. Not only is it either letting in more or less light, depending on which way you go, but it's also increasing or decreasing your depth of field. Now, on cheaper lenses, the depth of field isn't affected as much because the range of the aperture isn't as great, as I was mentioning before. So, in the more expensive lenses or the lenses with a wider aperture range, you end up having more of a depth of field. And what I mean by that is with a lens that has a 2.8 aperture, you could focus right on a person's eye, and their eyes and even their nose can be in focus, but their ears or even things behind their head might be out of focus. And it kind of creates a cool looking effect. And I'm sure you've seen it before in photos where, you know, the person or the subject is in focus and looks great, and then the background is just this beautiful blur of colors that made up what was behind the person. And that's, you know, depth of field or bokeh. There's a couple different terms for how that effect in a photo. So with these lenses, you know, depending on the look that you're going for and depending on what you're going to be shooting, making a lens choice is extremely important when choosing, you know, what you're going to shoot with. So for me, like I've mentioned when I was talking about lenses, I'm typically always shooting with my 24 to 70 or my 70 to 200. Those are both 2.8 lenses. So 2.8 is pretty good, and I can use those in low light situations combined with a decent shutter speed. I never really have to go too slow on my shutter speed because I can make up for it a little bit with my ISO. And so with the aperture, if I have to go to a lens or if I choose to go to one of my lenses that's a 1.2 aperture, I could accidentally focus on a nose and the eye could be out of focus. The depth of field is that shallow. So those are things that you have to be careful with when you start using lenses that have, you know, a really wide aperture like that. But the beneficial side is that you can take pictures in extremely low light situations, and then even on top of that, when you do have something appropriately focused, you get this really shallow depth of field, which is extremely cool looking in most situations. Not so cool in portraits because half the person's head's focused and the other half is blurry, but in the sense of, like, you know, shooting outdoors and doing things, you can get some really cool fall off with that depth of field. So aperture controls that. It controls the amount of light that's coming in to that sensor. So think about it as the gate. you have your light coming into your lens and you're getting as much light as possible coming into that lens. But then it hits the aperture, the iris of the aperture, and that is the gate that controls how much can flow through at any given time. And then it hits the shutter, or the how far the shutter is going to be opened, and affects the sensor. So that amount of light is being regulated by your aperture, and then it's also hitting your sensor, and your sensor is staying open a certain amount of time based on your shutter speed. So couple things that are happening throughout that process. And of course, automatic mode handles all of this for you, but then again, we all know that we're not getting the best quality out of that because those numbers tend to not be where they should be for what we're trying to expose for. So in figuring out your aperture, I typically will try my best to shoot with a 5.4 to an 8 or 9 aperture, because that is a good amount of depth of field so that when things are moving, I am able to keep them in focus without them coming out of focus. If I go down to 2.8 or even wider, then keeping something in focus is hard, because if I'm trying to take a picture of a person and they move back an inch and I'm shooting at like 1.4 or 2.8, they might be a little fuzzy now, and their photo might turn out a little smooth and not as sharp as I wanted it to be. And so with your aperture, if you can keep it up above 5, then you're going to have a little bit more room to play. And when I'm shooting weddings, I like that little bit of room to play because I've got people moving the whole time, and I'm not staying the exact same distance between them. And even though I can refocus, things happen in an instance, and I can't necessarily rely on my camera's ability to focus and my ability to move and adjust settings in a fast enough amount of time. So I try to keep my aperture up a little bit. When I do have more control over a situation, like my subjects are holding still and they're not moving, I will maybe drop that aperture number down and widen it up so I can get a shorter depth of field and have a cooler looking effect in my photo. There are things that I could play with a lot more when I don't have to worry about movement. And so with your aperture, finding a good aperture that lets in enough light so that your photo is exposed well without having to decrease your shutter or keep your shutter open a longer amount of time is important. So aperture becomes kind of a tool that you can use to avoid having to go too long with your shutter speed in lower light situations. It doesn't necessarily, you can use shutter speed to control, for example, when you want to use a higher or a higher aperture number, such as a 12 or something like that. You can make up for it with your shutter. But if you want to go the other way around and drag your shutter a little while and have your shutter stay open longer, you can increase your aperture number, which in a sense is closing down that gate tighter to prevent the more light coming in that your shutter is exposed to. So there's different things that you can do depending on what type of effect that you're going for in your photo. So like I mentioned before, we have the gate in your camera, which is the aperture, that controls the amount of light that comes in that's going to hit your sensor, and then your shutter speed controls the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to the light. Next, we're going to talk about ISO, which I use as kind of a buffer to help keep a happy medium between those numbers and help keep those numbers where I want them to be at.